Hey, welcome back. It's been a while since I've recorded a YouTube video. I want to let you know that I'm planning to make more YouTube videos on a hopefully regular frequency. This is pretty much me doing a voiceover for an illustration that I worked on earlier this afternoon. And I'm utilizing a lot of the techniques that I've covered on my previous videos where I use the Lasso tools to help me block out shapes to create a background composition. So what I'm doing right now is I'm using the Freeform Lasso tool to create some definition within that shape to give it kind of a mountain type feel. And every time I work with a shape, I'm putting it on its own layer. And what I'm doing right now is I'm extracting from that basic dark green shape using the Freeform Lasso tool to cut to create the sense of grass. And I'm starting out with a base color layer, and I'm essentially making selections and putting those selections onto their own layer using Command J, which is the keyboard shortcut to jump a selection or to duplicate a layer. So for most of this, I'm just using the Lasso tool because I'm dealing with a lot of organic edges. I could easily use the pen tool if I'm looking for something a little bit more precise. When I'm drawing, typically I'm using a Wacom Cintiq, and I use the stylus to create these illustrations, but this technique can also be utilized if you just have access to a mouse. It's a bit difficult to do it on a trackpad, but if you have a mouse, this technique is very, very doable. So here I'm thinking about the color values. I want the colors to get progressively lighter as we go from foreground to background. And I'm creating a pathway so that the eye has some leading lines to follow as it goes towards the horizon. So you'll notice that every layer has a specific shape. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the Hue and Saturation Tool, Command U, to quickly change the color values from the base color. So I can either make it lighter, darker, I can change the hue, I can change the saturation. It's a much, much faster way to work as opposed to having to go back to the colors panel or the swatches panel. So we'll complete the path here. And for the objects that are in the foreground, they're going to have more detail. So I'm going to come in and add some secondary shapes in the form of some striations or lines to kind of give it the sense of a well-worn path. And again, I'm using just the regular Freeform Lasso tool. Here I'm adding some grass. Sometimes for things like grass, I'll actually use the brush tool. It's a lot easier to just make simple lines with the brush tool, and I have a custom brush that I use for that. I'm using Photoshop CC 2020. I do that. I use that program for all my work. And here I'm just using the regular brush tool to make some blades of grass. I'm changing the color, alternating between some light and dark shades of that green. Start playing with the value of the sky. And here I'm adding some evergreen trees in the far distance. And again, I'm using a variety of triangular shapes. I'm sampling it from the sky layer to get those nice blues. And here I'm adding the actual trunk of the trees. I'll make those values a little bit darker. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some midground trees. Again, playing with shape and scale. I'll adjust the values so that they're a little bit lighter. Remember, the lighter an object is in a composition, the further away it is. So I didn't want those trees to be super saturated green. I wanted them to be a little bit more muted. And at the very back, I'll add a mountain range. I'm sampling from the blue, duplicating the selection, and I'm adding some secondary shapes to give that mountain some form. You can see that there's a hint of snow or bounced light. So I'm doing a layer check. And here's where I'm going to now add some ambient effects. I'm going to pick a light white value to put in the background just so I can blend that sky. And I'll make a new layer now, and I'll add some fence posts. The fence posts themselves create leading lines. It pulls the viewer follows the repeating fence posts into the composition. I'm holding down the Shift key to add to my selections. I'm using Alt backspace or Option delete on a Mac to quickly fill in my color values. I've covered these in previous videos. The tool that you're seeing me use here is Magic Squire. It has a little heads-up display that allows me to quickly select my brushes when I'm on the composition, as opposed to having to go to a panel to pick it on the side. It's super handy. It's about, I think $15-20. Well worth buying if you're using Photoshop for digital drawing. So here I'm doing a grayscale test. I want to see that there's enough contrast, and I had to adjust the contrast of the mountains to make them stand apart from some of the midground objects. I've mapped the grayscale, so basically I'm toggling into a grayscale space with a keyboard shortcut. You can find that under View, Proof Setup. Now I'm adding some details to the fence. This is just going to be just using the regular brush tool. Just making lines that mimic wood grain. My ultimate plan, I would like to do some live streaming of these digital drawings so that I can have people pop in and hang out while I work and maybe ask questions and so forth. If this is something that you would be interested in, just drop me a comment and let me know. And then what I'm thinking about tentatively doing is, if there's enough interest in this, I would like to maybe do it on a Friday evening, say at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Just because that gives me time to go ahead and record. The house is quiet, and it's a good time to work. But let me know what times work best. Would weekend times work best? Add some feedback in the comments if you don't mind. So I have a basic landscape set up, and I'm adding some rocks here on the top just to kind of break up the composition a little bit, to give some more shape variations, I guess, just to make that more interesting. And also I'm thinking about a light source for these 3 or 4 rocks. I'm using the Lasso tool to carve out the shadowed areas. giving some definition. I'm adding striations or lines. I'm also adding small dots to the rocks, and then I wanted to go back and add a few additional details. In the next second or two, I'll be actually putting down some boards, some planks of wood, just to kind of add some sense of scale and also to add some kind of a narrative element. It doesn't have to be a very deep narrative, but it needs to have some basic, sense of like who, what, where, when, why, so it allows the viewer to kind of explore the area a little bit more. And so it's not just a generic path on the road, but maybe there are certain things that draw your eye. And so that's what I was kind of thinking about during this particular phase. And here I'm just playing more with value to ensure that there's sufficient contrast between the foreground, midground, and background objects. You can see that the fence and the mountain that's on the left-hand side, that little mound, those are dark components, so I have to make the grass in the foreground also darker too. And what that does is it kind of pushes the depth in the midground and the background. So everything you're seeing here is me working real time. I didn't speed up this video. This is pretty much how fast I typically work. Here I'm adding some slight details to the grass that's in the midground. And at this point I'm still thinking about ideas for what else to incorporate, and I will be adding those boards. Up above. So here I'm using a soft brush tool with purple or some dark value here, and I'm just putting it around the edges, and what that tends to do is it pushes the viewer further into the composition, because we move away from dark values in towards lighter values. So I've applied these darker values just as a framing device to move the viewer into the midground. And I'm using multiply layer settings for that. And I'm using kind of a pinkish saturated value along with the screen layer effect to give the impression of some bounced light or scattered light that's affecting the objects that are in the scene. And it kind of gives it there's a subtle gradient effect that you get. It's not as heavy-handed as using the gradient tool, but it's still pretty effective. So here I've got the polygon lasso tool selected. At this point I'm just kind of contemplating what I want to do. And now I was thinking about maybe adding like a ladder or something, but I felt that would be too busy, so I'm going to just now move down towards the layer that's below the rocks, and I'm just using the polygon lasso tool here to create just some random boards. And I'll use the brush tool to add some nails. Here I'm using the regular lasso tool to add some texture, making some lighter values so that we know that the board is in fact made of wood. adding some other little doodads, other objects. And again, that's the Magic Squire tool. It works as an extension in Photoshop, and I find it to be incredibly useful. So adding some barbed wire, some nails, just other little things that kind of break up that shape. Adding a little bit of damage to the board too. The color shift you're seeing here is a result of my Cintiq acting up. It does some color shifts that are unintentional. So anyway, that's the video. If you like it, please let me know. If you want to do, if you want me to do a live stream session, please drop me a line. Thanks for watching.